The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 19. Lost. Grace burst out crying. She said she knew it was silly, and not at all what an outdoor girl should do, and very contritely afterward she told the others how sorry she was that she had given way. But she just could not seem to help it. Without reserve she sobbed on Amy's shoulder. For a moment Molly and Betty, looking at one another, feared that Amy too would give way to her feelings, and that they would have two hysterical ones on their hands. But the little outburst of Grace seemed to act as a sort of tonic to Amy, who put her arms about her chum, murmuring comforting words. "Oh, what are we going to do?" sobbed Grace. "We're not going to cry, at any rate," snapped Molly. "At least I'm not." There was an incisiveness, a sharpness to her voice that made Grace look up a bit angrily. I'm not crying," she said, and there was more energy in her voice than had been noticeable for some time. "Well, it's a very good imitation of it then," went on Molly. "Crying isn't going to do any good, and it gets on the nerves of all of us." "I'm sorry, I couldn't seem to help it," spoke Grace in a low voice. I won't do it again. But oh, what are we going to do?" No one knew what to answer. Certainly they were in a situation that needed help to enable them to escape from it. They could not approach the alligators, at least they did not think they could, though perhaps the creatures would have fled when the girls came near. And the snakes, while not aggressive, seemed to be numerous in the water that offered the only ford to shore. And moccasins, the girls had been told, were deadly poisonous. "If Tom would only come," muttered Betty. "I can't see what keeps him," and she looked anxiously toward where the luncheon was spread, but there was no sign of the young man. "Maybe we could drive the snakes away by throwing more stones," suggested Grace, who seemed to have gotten over her little hysterical outburst. "Let's try it." "It's worth trying," admitted Betty. "At least I don't believe the snakes would come out to attack us, and we might be able to drive them away." The girls, glad of the chance to do something, collected a pile of stones and showered them into the water. Then, when the ripples had cleared, they peered anxiously at the sandbar. "They're gone!" cried Amy joyously. "Now we can wade to shore." "Better wait," advised Molly. There was an anxious pause, and then Betty said in a hopeless sort of tone, "No, there they come back again," and she pointed to where the writhing serpents could be seen. Evidently the sandbar was a sort of feeding place for them, and though they might disappear for the moment at some disturbance, they returned. Hopelessly the girls looked at one another. Then they glanced into the water, that seemed fairly swarming with the snakes. There appeared to be more than ever of them. Then Amy looked toward the neck of land and gave a cry of surprise, of joy. "Look!" she exclaimed. "They're going! The alligators! At least they're moving!" "I hope they don't move toward us," gasped Grace. The saurians indeed seemed waked into life. Whether they had completed their sun-bath, or whether the call of their appetites moved them, it was impossible to say. But they were walking about, dragging their ponderous, fat, squatty bodies and their big tails. "Let's tell 'em we're in a hurry," suggested Betty, as she caught up a stone. Running forward, she threw it with such good aim that it struck one of the saurians on the head. With a sort of surprised grunt, the creature slid off the narrow neck of sand into the water. The other followed with a splash. "There they go!" cried Molly. "Come on now, before they take a notion to come back. Oh, girls, I'm nearly starved." Betty laughed at this. It was characteristic of Molly, once the immediate stress was removed, to revert to the matter that had previously claimed her attention, and this had been their luncheon. "Come on!" she cried, and ran toward the main shore. Betty said afterward that they had never run so fast, not even at the school games, where the outdoor girls had made records for themselves on the cinder track. Just who reached shore first is a matter of no moment. In fact, it must have been a dead heat, as Tom Osborne said afterward. As the girls passed the place where the alligators had been sunning themselves, they gave one look each into the water where the saurians had disappeared. One look only, and they did not pause to do that, but they saw no signs of the ugly creatures. "Safe!" cried Betty, and the girls, breathless from their run, were safe. They gathered about the eatables on the grass. "Oh, where can Tom be?" cried Betty anxiously. I hope nothing has happened to him." "Now who is making direful suggestions, I'd like to know?" asked Grace. "Well, it is queer to have him disappear that way," voiced Molly, "but I'm going to be impolite and eat." She approached the table, an example followed by the others. Certainly Tom had done his work exceedingly well. The spread was very inviting. Betty looked all around the little glade on the edge of the river where the table was set. There was no sign of their escort. The Gem floated lazily where she was moored, and the scene was quiet and peaceful enough, but there was a certain mystery about the disappearance of Tom Osborne. "Well, we may as well eat," sighed Betty. "Then we can look about a bit. There won't be any alligators inland, I guess." Even the fright the girls had experienced had not taken away their appetites, and soon they were making merry over the meal, which was a bountiful one. They could well trust Aunt Hannah for that. But between bites, as it were, Betty and the others looked about for a sign of the young man. He did not appear, however, nor were there any sounds of his approach. The woods back from the river teemed with bird and animal life. The latter was not so visible as the former, for the feathered creatures flitted here and there amid the branches, bursting into various melodious notes. The meal went on. It was finished. The girls packed up with a little sense of disappointment. They felt that their outing had been rather spoiled. They saved enough for Tom in case he should come back hungry, which would very likely be the case. "Well, we may as well put things on board," said Betty at length. "We can't stay here much longer. It's getting late." "But ought we go back without Tom?" asked Molly. "I don't see what else we can do. If he doesn't come," said Betty, "we can't stay here all night." The Gem was made ready for the trip back. Then came a time of anxious waiting as the shadows lengthened. Betty, as well as the others, was getting nervous. "We simply must go," said the little captain at length. "He will have to come back as best he can. I don't see what made him go away. I am quite sure Mr. Hammond will not like it." "But if we go, can Tom find his way back?" asked Grace. "He'll have to. But of course we'll tell Mr. Hammond, and he and some of the men can come for Tom, if they think it necessary." There seemed nothing else to do, and presently the girls went aboard, taking the remains of the lunch with them. "We ought to leave some sort of note for Tom, telling him what happened, and that we couldn't wait any longer," suggested Molly, as Betty was about to start. "That's so. I didn't think of that. We'll do it." "And leave him some lunch, too," voiced Amy. "Good!" cried Betty. "Tom has one friend at least." A goodly packet of lunch was done up, and placed in a tree, well wrapped, where it would be sure to be seen. Then a note was left, with a brief account of what had happened, and the information that the girls had gone back to Orangeade. "He ought to see that," remarked Betty, stepping back to inspect her handiwork. She had pinned a small square of white paper containing the writing to a sheet of light brown manila, so that it was visible for some distance. "It looks like a whole book instead of a note," laughed Molly. The Gem was started and began dropping down the branch stream toward the main river. At least the girls hoped it was the main river when they turned into a larger body of water. But as they puffed on amid the lengthening shadows, an annoying doubt began to manifest itself in Betty's mind. She glanced at the shores from time to time. "Girls," she said finally, "does everything look right?" "Do you mean your hair?" asked Amy. "No, I mean the scenery. Is it familiar? Have we been here before? Did we come this way?" They all stared at Betty. What do you mean?" faltered Grace. "Well, I don't seem to remember this place," went on Betty. "I'm afraid we've taken the wrong turn in the river, and that—" "You don't mean to say that we're lost—" The Outdoor Girls in Florida, by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 20. The Loon. Onward chugged the Gem, and the sudden acceleration in the heartbeats of the girls seemed to keep time with the staccato exhaust of the motor. "Lost!" faltered Grace. "And night coming on," echoed Amy. "Oh, you too!" cried Molly. "I wish I were a boy." "Why?" asked Betty, as she guided her craft to the center of the stream. It was lighter there, for they were not so much under the overhanging trees with their festoons of moss. "Why, Molly dear?" "Then I could use slang, such as, 'Oh, well, what's the use? I don't suppose it would do any good.'" "But are you sure we are lost?" asked Amy. "What makes you say so, Betty?" "Because this place doesn't look at all like any part of the river we came down before. The trouble was that we let Tom steer, and we didn't notice the course very much, as we should have done on coming in a new channel. But I'm sure we are lost." "It isn't a very pleasant thing to be sure about," said Molly grimly, "but we may as well face the worst. Grace, let's you and I look to our stock of provisions." "What for?" asked Grace, who had found a few stray pieces of candy in a box and was contentedly eating them. "Well, if we're lost, that doesn't mean we're not going to eat, and if we have enough for supper and breakfast—" "Breakfast!" cried Grace. "Are we going to be here for breakfast?" "And stay out all night?" added Amy. "There may be no help for it," said Betty, as calmly as she could. "We have slept aboard before this, and we can do it again." "But you're not going to give up without trying to get back to the grove, are you?" asked Molly, who after the first shock was her own brave self again, as was Betty. "Of course I'm going to try," replied Betty, "but that doesn't mean we'll get there. Often, after you're lost, trying to find your way back again only makes you lost the more, especially with night coming on." "But what are we going to do?" queried Grace blankly. She had ceased eating candy now. "Well, it's very evident that we're not going the right way," went on Betty. "The farther we go, the more sure I am that we were never on this part of the stream before, so I think we had better turn back, and if necessary start over again from where we had lunch. We may be able to see the right turn by starting over once more. Then we will be all right. Once I am started on the right track, I think I can follow it. We have a compass, and I noticed in a general way which direction we came, though I was not as careful as I should have been." "But it will be very dark," objected Amy. "It is getting darker all the while." "That will be the worst of it," admitted Betty frankly, "and if we find we can't go on, we shall have to tie up for the night. We might do worse." "But anchor far enough from shore so that nothing can get us," pleaded Grace. "No alligators, I mean." "Don't worry, they won't come aboard," declared Betty. "These rivers are split up into a lot of side brooks, bayous, and such things," said Molly. "Tom mentioned that, and he said that often one could wander about in them being close to the right route all the while and yet not know a thing about it." "Cheerful prospect," remarked Grace. "Oh, I'm sure we'll get on the right stream sometime," spoke Molly cheerfully. "What do you say? Had we not better turn back?" They all agreed that this was best, and soon, in the fast-gathering dusk, the Gem was swung about and was breasting the rather sluggish current. To the credit of the outdoor girls be it said that even in this nerve-racking emergency they did not altogether lose heart and courage. Of course, there was that first instinctive fear and something like a gasping for breath, as when one plunges into cold water, but the reaction came, and the girls were themselves once more, brave and self-reliant. "I only hope we don't pass the stream up which we went to have our lunch," spoke Molly as they went on. She and the others were peering from side to side in the gloom. "Oh, I'm sure we can find that," declared Betty. "There is a big dead cypress tree with a lot of moss on it just at the turn. We must watch for that." There were one or two false alarms before they saw it, but finally they were all sure of the turn, and Betty made it. "Oh, are you going all the way back to where we ate?" asked Grace, as Betty guided her craft into the branch stream. "I think so," answered the little captain. "It will not take much longer, and we may find Tom there. If we do, all our troubles will be over. I think we had better go up." "But it's getting dark so fast," objected Grace. "Then a little more dark won't make much difference," returned Molly with a shrug. "Go on, Betty." The Gem chugged her way up Alligator Brook, as the girls had named it. Eagerly they looked for some sign of their missing escort, and listened for any sound that would indicate he was coming to meet them. But the forest was silent. Night was settling down, and birds and beasts were seeking their resting places. They reached the place where the boat had been tied, and could see where they had eaten their lunch. Over in the gloom there fluttered the paper Betty had fastened to a tree to indicate to Tom the fact that his charges had left. "He hasn't been here," said Molly in a low voice. "No, there's the packet of lunch," went on Grace, pointing to it. "We may need it ourselves." Betty said nothing, but in the semi-darkness her chums could see the worried look on her face. Suddenly there was a crashing through the underbrush, announcing the approach of someone. "Here he comes!" exclaimed Amy. "Let's call," suggested Grace. "Wait a minute," advised Betty. The figure of a young man came into view. He looked about him nervously, turning his head from side to side like a timid bird. "That isn't Tom," said Molly. Low as her voice was, the youth heard. He fairly... The Outdoor Girls in Florida by Laura Lee Hope. Chapter 21. To the Rescue. For a few seconds it was like a tableau. The strange young man, more ragged than before, if that were possible, standing in the midst of the clearing and gazing as though spellbound at the girls in the motorboat. On their part, Betty and her chums, following the half-whispered announcement made by Betty, stared at the loon almost as if he might be a ghost of the Florida forest. For perhaps a quarter of a minute they all remained thus, scarcely moving, hardly breathing, and then the young man made a slow turn. He seemed about to plunge back into the tangle whence he had come. "Don't do that," said Molly, hardly above a whisper. "He mustn't do that." And she seemed appealing to her chums. "We must keep him here, speak to him. Perhaps he knows where Tom went." "Or, if he doesn't, perhaps he can tell us which way to go to get home," breathed Grace. "He's some company, anyhow." The loon, to give him the title bestowed on him by the men in the boat, hesitated as he caught the sound of whispering. He shifted from one foot to the other, much after the manner of some animal seeking to escape unnoticed. He took a step backward. By this time Betty had brought her boat close to the extending tree branch, where she had made fast before. The power had been shut off, and the gem had drifted to the former mooring place. Now Betty was ready for action. "I beg your pardon," she said in a low voice, and with an intonation calculated to disperse the fears of even the most timid youth, "but will you be so good as to help us again? We are the girls, you know, whose boat you got when the manatee was towing it away." What?" gasped the other, and he seemed much afraid. "We're the same girls," went on Betty. "You know, we saw you poling down the river that day. If you come closer you can see us and make sure. We need help again. We are lost, and a friend of ours is missing. Wait, I'll light the lamps." And with a turn of the switch Betty set aglow the electric lights, operated by a storage battery. The youth started again. Clearly he was a most timid creature. "We saw the men who were after you," put in Molly, thinking to add to his confidence, "and we didn't tell. Did we, girls?" "No," came in a chorus. In spite of the rather unprepossessing appearance of the youth, the girls were glad to see him. "Now will you help us again?" asked Molly. "We've had a dreadful time, and we need help. You won't go away, will you?" "No," was the hesitating answer. "I came to look for you, but I wasn't sure. You see, I have to be so careful." "Gracious, I wonder if he thinks we wanted to capture him," thought Grace, feeling about amid the cushions for some chocolates. That was a sure sign Grace had recovered her equanimity. "You came to look for us?" echoed Betty wonderingly. "Yes, miss," was the answer. "He sent me to find you." "He? Who do you mean?" Betty questioned anxiously. "Tom Osborne. He told me to come here and tell you he couldn't come." "Couldn't come? Why?" Betty's voice had a note of fear in it now. "'Cause they've caught him. He's cotched, miss." "Caught? By whom?" It was Molly who questioned now. Before answering, the loon, which name seemed to fit the poor creature well, glided forward, glancing back nervously over his shoulder now and then, as though he feared pursuit. "Oh, dear," murmured Grace. "I don't like this. It's worse than the ghost of the island." "Be quiet," urged Betty. "It might be all right yet. I'm going to light more lamps." Thus far she had only set aglow one in the after cockpit and the red and green side lights together with the one on the small signal mast. Now she flooded the cabin with radiance, for it was getting more and more gloomy in the forest clearing. "Won't you come aboard?" urged Betty kindly. "We will do all we can for Tom Osborne if he is in trouble. We can't understand why he deserted us. We have been in much distress. We got lost and had to come back. Come aboard and tell us all about it so we will know what to do. Perhaps you are hungry. We left food there," and she indicated it. "Bring it here, and then perhaps you can take us back to the bungalow. The men there will organize a searching party if need be. But tell us who has caught Tom." The loon did not answer for a minute. He looked to where Betty pointed, saw the packet of food, and went toward it eagerly. Then he brought it to the moored boat. "I am hungry," he said simply. "Then eat first and talk later," urged Molly. "I know what it is to be hungry." "I'll admit I'm hungry now," said Grace. "We left enough food so we could have some, I think." "Hush, we had a good lunch," said Betty, "and there is no telling what will happen before morning. Grace, you and Amy might make some hot chocolate." "Will you tell us your name now, or are you still afraid?" asked Betty of the youth, who was eating ravenously. "The men called you the Loon, I believe it was." "Yes, miss, that's my name. You see, I'm not quite right in the head. I got hurt when I was a baby. I'm harmless, but I can't do much work. I'm not strong. My name is Harry Jackson." "And have you no home, no friends?" "Not as I knows on, miss, no. I had an uncle once, but he died. I live around the camps. Sometimes the men is good to me, and sometimes not." He ate quickly but daintily, and was not all uncouth. From time to time he glanced about like some frightened animal. "They calls me the Loon," he went on, "but I know some things. I know more than they want me to." "Do you think you could pilot this boat to Mr. Stonington's place?" asked Molly with much anxiety. "Yes, miss, I could. I know my way all around these waters. I can take you there. But we ought to help him. Help Tom and the other one. I promised I'd come for you." "Then tell us where Tom is. Who has him? How did he come to send you for us? Who is the other one?" Betty questioned thus rapidly. The loon passed his hand over his forehead as though to brush away the cobwebs from his poor brain. Then he said, "The same men caught him, miss." "What same men?" "The ones who were after me. There's a camp back there in the woods, and they have him, and the other one, too. I started for help for him long ago, but they got after me and took me back. Then they brought Tom in this afternoon. He saw me and told me to come for you. They didn't see him, tell me. We've got to go to the rescue." "I should say we had!" exclaimed Betty. "This is all very mysterious, Harry." She could not bear to call him the Loon. "Can you tell us any more about all this? Why did Tom go away?" "That's it!" cried the queer youth. "That's what I've been trying to remember. He told me to be sure and tell you that he didn't run away. He saw you getting flowers, he said, and he went off in the woods away to look for some rare kind for you. He didn't mean to go so far. Then the men caught him and took him away before he could warn you. That's what he wanted me to be sure and tell you. Now I've remembered." And he seemed quite pleased in his own peculiar way. "But who is this other one you started to help?" asked Grace, a strange eagerness creeping into her voice. "Wait, please wait," begged the Loon, again passing his hand over his brow. "I can't think very fast. I know the bad men in the lumber camp had Tom and the other one. I don't know his name. But maybe we can rescue them both, if you'll come." He sprang from the boat to the tree branch and thence ashore.